The summer of 1974 never really ended in Santa Marina. It just folded itself into the air, into the salt, into the golden dust that still clings to the hills. Back then, the town lived slowly, like a photograph developing in soft light. Radios drifted through open windows, playing Fleetwood Mac and Elton John, and children traced the outlines of kites against a sky that seemed too big to ever close in. Days began with fog that smelled of oranges from the inland groves, and ended in a hush of ocean wind brushing the palms along the highway. It was a season that promised permanence, the kind of endlessness only youth can believe in. People still talk about that summer in the past tense, but never as an ending, more like a page that simply refused to turn. Before the heat wave, before the search parties, before the headlines, everything in Santa Marina felt half asleep, content in its smallness. The town was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's middle names, where the gas station owner played chess with the sheriff on Tuesday afternoons, and where teenagers' laughter could echo clear across the bluffs. Yet beneath that postcard perfection, something else was waiting, something invisible, patient, like a shadow learning the shape of light. Among those teenagers was a girl named Leah Warren, 17, freckles the color of sand, hair the color of early wheat. People remember her because she was the kind who noticed things others missed. She carried a Polaroid camera almost everywhere, snapping strangers and sunsets, empty swings and cloud banks that looked like sleeping animals. She said she liked how the pictures told the truth too quickly. Sometimes she rode her bike down to the cliffs after dinner, chasing the last light, her camera bumping softly against her shoulder. That July, the air itself seemed to hum. It was a kind of summer where time stretched and blurred, where one evening bled into another. No one realized that Leah's rides had become longer, that she had started lingering near the old lighthouse after dark, watching the sea as if it might whisper back. No one asked what she was trying to find through her lens. They just smiled and waved when they saw her coasting downhill, hair flying, her laughter carried by the wind. When the first hint of what was coming arrived, it didn't look like danger. It looked like a dusk cloud rolling in from the west. It looked like a mother glancing at the clock and thinking her daughter was late for dinner. It looked like nothing at all. But the moment is there, frozen forever somewhere between the clicks of Leah's shutter. The instant before the world realized it was about to lose her. Later, people would replay that evening in their minds like a looped reel. The sun dissolving into the horizon, the golden air dimming to copper, the tire tracks vanishing into the road's curve. They'd talk about the heat, how it made the asphalt shimmer, how the ocean smelled faintly metallic that day. They'd wonder if she turned her head, if she saw someone behind her, if she stopped to take one last photograph. The town itself seemed to hold its breath in the days that followed. Streetlights buzzed louder. The sea sounded closer at night, and the gulls that usually gathered near the pier flew inland, as if they sensed the silence that was coming. Sometimes memory distorts itself to survive. It polishes the terror, round the edges, lets the past appear softer than it was. But there's a line that locals still whisper when they talk about Leah Warren, that the summer of '74 never ended, because it didn't have a chance to. It was stolen, suspended somewhere between the innocence of a girl with a camera and the darkness that swallowed her path home. Even now, if you stand on the cliffs at sunset, the air still carries that warmth, the afterglow of what was lost. The wind moves through the reeds with the same hush that once wrapped around her laughter. And for a heartbeat, you could believe the story never truly happened, that Leah never vanished, that she's still out there, framing the world through her lens, chasing the light before it disappears. Leah Warren had a way of seeing the world that made ordinary things feel haunted. To most people, the California coast was just brightness and salt, the hum of cars on Highway 1, the endless roll of waves, but to her it was layered, full of hidden moods. She said once that light could tell secrets if you waited long enough to watch it fade. Maybe that's why she loved her Polaroid camera. It wasn't just a toy. It was her way of keeping things still, a fragile promise against the passing of time. She'd save for that camera herself, working at the corner cafe after school, sliding coins into a jar marked dreams and film. When she finally bought it, she held it like something alive. The flash made her blink every time, but she'd smile afterward, shaking the photo until an image bloomed out of the white. She liked that moment. The waiting, the slow reveal. It's like watching a ghost arrive, she told Amy once, her best friend since childhood. Amy just laughed, thinking Leah was being poetic again. But Leah wasn't joking. People remember her differently. To her teachers, she was quiet but bright, the sort of student who would turn an essay into a story, who quoted poems when she didn't have answers. To her mother, Diane, she was restless, always chasing the edge of something. To her younger brother, she was just a sister who hummed while washing dishes, who could make even silence sound like music. She wasn't popular in the traditional way. She wasn't a cheerleader or the homecoming queen, but she carried a kind of gravity. You noticed her without realizing why. On her bedroom wall, she pinned Polaroids of clouds, hundreds of them. She said she wanted to capture every kind of sky the ocean could make. Some were soft and rose-colored, others bruised and dark. When she spoke about them, she'd tilt her head like she was listening to something distant. They all move the same way, she said once. Even when they're gone, they're still up there somewhere. Her friends never knew what she meant. The week before she disappeared, Leah seemed distracted. Amy said she'd been skipping hangouts, choosing instead to wander the cliffs after sunset with her camera. She returned smelling of seaweed and rain, her hair tangled from the wind. One night, she told Amy that she'd been taking photos of the water and saw something strange, something that didn't belong. It looked like light under the surface, she whispered, but it wasn't a reflection. It was moving. Amy thought she was joking again. Leah just smiled faintly and said, "Maybe some things only show up for the camera." The last roll of film Leah took was found in her room, hidden inside an envelope marked "Develop Soon." The pictures, when printed, were nothing like her usual work. They were darker, moodier, angles of rocks, parts of waves, reflections that didn't make sense. One photo showed the edge of a person's shadow reaching across the sand toward hers. Another was of the old highway curve, the guardrail catching the final orange light. But the last photograph stood apart. It was the ocean at dusk, empty, endless, blurred as if taken while her hands were trembling. Her mother stared at that image for hours after Leah vanished. There was something uneasy about it, something that I couldn't quite name. The horizon wasn't straight, the water looked like smoke, and in the far corner of the frame, almost invisible, was a shape, just a faint smudge of darker blue, shaped almost like a human silhouette. When the police asked, Diane said she thought it might have been a trick of light, but she couldn't stop wondering why Leah had chosen to take it, and why it was the last one on the roll. The camera, the photos, her notebooks, all became part of the investigation later, but at the time, they were simply pieces of Leah's quiet universe. She'd always been drawn to what others overlooked. The half-lit things, the liminal moments between day and night. Her art teacher once told her she photographed absence better than anyone he'd ever seen. Leah had smiled shyly and said, "Maybe absence is all we ever get to keep." Friends from school describe her as a little distant in the months leading up to that summer. Not sad exactly, more like she was slipping into a thought she couldn't climb out of. She'd bring her camera to bonfires and barely talk, just watch the flames flicker and the faces fade behind smoke. Someone once asked her what she was photographing, and she said, "I don't know yet. I think I'll find out later." Sometimes, when the wind was still, she would walk barefoot along the beach after midnight. Locals remembered seeing her figure moving like a shadow beneath the moonlight. Pause and take a picture of nothing at all. She told Amy once that she could feel the sea remembering things. That maybe the ocean didn't erase. It only kept secrets in deeper layers. Like film, she said. You can burn it, tear it, but something always stays. Those words would come back to haunt Amy later. Because when Leah vanished, it wasn't just her that disappeared. It was a sense of clarity that she left behind. The photographs, the fragments, the way she saw the world, they all hinted at something no one could explain. Afterward, when the police examined the final picture again, they said it might have been taken moments before sunset, maybe minutes before she was last seen. The grain of the film suggested movement, a quick shutter pressed by unsteady hands. But there was something else too, some faint reflection near the waterline, as if someone else had been standing there with her, just outside the frame. People like to say Leah lived half in reality, half in reverie. But those who loved her knew she was searching for meaning in places most people wouldn't dare look. And in her final days, it felt as though she had found something that frightened her enough to capture it, to keep it, to prove it existed. Her last photograph, blurred and wordless, became both evidence and elegy, a silent message from a girl who saw the world too clearly. It would hang on her mother's wall for decades after, a reminder that sometimes the most haunting stories are the ones we almost understand, the ones trapped in the flicker between what's real and what's already gone. It was July 12, 1974, a Friday evening that began like every other, with a hum of cicadas and the faint echo of waves hitting the cliffs below San Marino. The kind of evening that made people linger outdoors, the heat pressing softly against the skin, the world glowed with that half-golden, half-fading light that belongs only to California summers. No one in town remembers any sudden change in the air, no omen, no warning. But sometimes, tragedy doesn't arrive with thunder. It glides in quietly, disguised as another ordinary day. Leah left home a little before 6. Her mother remembered the moment precisely. Leah tying her hair into a loose braid, slipping her camera strap over her shoulder, and saying she wanted to catch the last good light. Diane asked if she'd be back for dinner. Leah smiled, that calm, distracted smile that parents mistake for reassurance, and said, "Just a few minutes. The tide's perfect tonight." Those were the last words she ever heard her daughter speak. The Warren house sat on a narrow street that wound down toward the coast. Neighbors saw Leah roll past on her blue Schwinn bicycle, the streamers on the handlebars fluttering in the breeze. She wore a yellow windbreaker, one she bought secondhand because she liked how it looked like sunlight. Several people would later recall that jacket clearly. It stood out against the darkening road, bright and impossible to miss. She rode through town like she always did, coasting downhill toward the cliffs, her camera slung across her back, her hair catching in the wind. At the corner of Sycamore and Main, she waved to Mr. Keating, the postman, who was locking up his shop. He waved back, always smiling, that girl, he'd say years later, his voice quieter, like the memory still unsettled him. At the gas station, 2 boys filling up a Camaro said they saw her ride past, standing on the pedals to climb the hill. One of them remembered a yellow car behind her, an old Plymouth, maybe pale gold or cream. But the other boys swore there was no car at all, just the fading sound of bicycle spokes. As Leah reached the outer edge of town, the air changed. The scent of asphalt gave way to salt and wild sage. The road narrowed to a single lane, lined with eucalyptus trees that whispered as she passed. Beyond them, the cliffs stretched wide and endless, the Pacific glimmering below like a sheet of molten glass. Locals called this stretch of road the Curve, a place where teenagers came to watch the sunset or park with radios low, pretending not to be afraid of the drop that yawned beyond the guardrail. No one saw Leah reach that curve. That's where her trail ended. The police report later reconstructed the timeline with clinical precision. 6:12 p.m., seen by the postman. 6:19 p.m., seen by the boys at the gas station. 6:25 p.m., a woman driving north claims to have glimpsed a figure on a bicycle near the cliff road. Possibly Leah, though the light was already dim. After that, silence. No tire marks, no bicycle, no sign of a fall. It was as if the road itself had simply opened and swallowed her whole. By nightfall, her mother began to worry. The ocean winds had risen, shaking the windows. Dinner went cold on the table. At 7:30, Diane called Amy, hoping Leah had stopped by. Amy hadn't seen her since school. By 8, the sheriff's office was notified. They sent a single patrol car to the cliffs, its headlights sweeping across the empty road, illuminating nothing but fog and tall grass bending in the wind. Volunteers joined before midnight. Flashlights combed the trail down to the beach. The waves crashed violently against the rocks below, spraying mist into the air. Searchers found footprints near the path, small, narrow, barefoot, but they led in both directions, as if someone had been pacing. No tire tracks nearby, no skid marks, just the sound of the sea, pounding endlessly against stone. Diane refused to leave. She stood by the guardrail, gripping Leah's camera strap in her hands, calling her daughter's name over the roar of the surf. She loved this place, she kept saying. she wouldn't have gone far. The deputies promised they'd keep searching through the night. But by dawn, the fog had thickened, erasing everything, the cliffs, the trail, even the horizon itself. It was as if the ocean had taken not just Leah, but the very proof she'd ever been there. The next morning, her father arrived from Los Angeles, hollow-eyed, clutching a newspaper that hadn't yet printed her name. Helicopters swept the coastline, their shadows dragging across the water. Divers went down near the rocks, where the tide formed deep pockets of darkness. They found driftwood, seaweed, fragments of shells. But no bicycle, no camera, no jacket. Nothing. Theories came quickly, as they always do. Some said she must have lost control of her bike and fallen into the sea. Others whispered about a car stopping at the curve, about headlights in the mist, about a scream the wind might have carried away. A few suggested she'd simply run, escape the quiet suffocation of Santa Marina to start over somewhere else. But no one who knew Leah believed that. She wasn't running from something. If anything, she'd been moving toward it. In the following days, the search area widened. Reporters came, hungry for the first missing girl headline of summer. They took pictures of the cliffs, of the police cars, of Diane's face turned toward the sea. The local paper called it the vanishing at Sunset Curve. It sounded poetic in print, almost romantic. But the people who stood on that road at dusk knew better. They knew the quiet that followed wasn't mystery. It was grief disguised as silence. That week, the sunset seemed different. The ocean looked heavier, the colors duller. Even the air felt altered, like the whole town was holding its breath. Children stopped riding their bikes alone. Parents locked their doors earlier. And somewhere along the cliffs, in the space between memory and imagination, Leah's laughter still seemed to echo, soft, distant, carried away by wind and water. Years later, locals would still point to that curve when talking to visitors, their voices hushed without knowing why. The road is still there, winding like a ribbon above the Pacific. The guardrail has been replaced, the asphalt repaved. But when a light falls just right, that same golden light Leah went chasing, it glints across the meadow with a faint, flickering reflection, like the shimmer of a camera flash. And for a brief, almost imperceptible instant, it feels as though she's still descending that hill, hair untangled by wind, her bicycle wheels whispering through the heat, the girl with the yellow jacket, riding toward the horizon, carrying the last light of the summer that would never end. The morning after Leah vanished, the ocean was glassy and gray, the kind of stillness that feels staged, too calm, too watchful. Santa Marina woke in fragments, a mother's voice cracking through the phone lines, the hum of sheriff's radio, the faint smell of salt and dread drifting inland. By dawn, news had spread from porch to porch. A teenager was missing, not just late, not runaway missing. Gone. The town, with its white fences and hibiscus blooms, had never needed to use that word before. They began searching before the sun even cleared the hills. Deputies cordoned off the cliff road, setting cones in the mist, while volunteers gathered at the high school gym, bringing coffee, flashlights, and maps. It was still early enough that some believed she'd turn up laughing. Maybe she'd gone camping. Maybe her bike chain had snapped. Maybe she just lost track of time. But the light in Diane Warren's eyes told a different story. She stood near the sign-in table, arms wrapped around herself. Leah's camera strap looped around her wrist like a relic. She didn't speak much, only asked if anyone had checked the old path near the lighthouse. The first day's search covered the bluffs, the shoreline, the winding gullies that dropped into the sea. Helicopters traced the coastline in slow arcs, their blades chopping through the morning quiet. Onlookers gathered by the guardrail, staring down into the rocks below as if their focus could make her appear. The ocean's voice was relentless, drowning out the shouts of searchers. "Leah," they called again and again, but each cry came back warped and thin. That evening, the sheriff, Tom Halpern, a man who'd spent his whole life in Santa Marina and thought he'd seen every kind of loss, sat with Diane on the hood of his patrol car. He told her they'd find something soon, a footprint, a scrap of fabric, a tire mark. "Things don't just vanish," he said softly. But the wind off the cliffs made him shiver. He didn't sound convinced. By the second day, the search spread farther north, where the coastline fractured into coves and hidden inlets. Divers went into the water, feeling their way along the jagged stones. The sea was cold, deeper than the charts claimed, its visibility poor. They surfaced with cuts on their hands, and nothing to show but kelp and driftwood. One diver said he felt a current pulling in strange directions, like something alive was breathing beneath the surface. No one repeated that in front of Diane. Meanwhile, volunteers combed inland trails, calling Leah's name into the eucalyptus groves. Dogs picked up faint scents that disappeared near the highway. For every hour that passed, the silence grew heavier. Not the clean quiet of peace, but the thick kind that gathers when a question refuses to answer itself. On the third day, television crews arrived. They filmed the cliffs, the tired volunteers, the photographs of Leah taped to lampposts. Her senior portrait, soft smile, hair caught by wind, became the image everyone saw. The captions changed as the days went on. Local girl missing, then ongoing search effort enters day 4, then hope fades for Santa Marina teen. The story was clean, simple, consumable. But in the living rooms where a friend sat watching, it felt obscene. To see her face turn into a headline, her life reduced to frame. Amy tried to help with the search, but she could barely speak. She kept holding one of Leah's Polaroids, the one the beach they'd gone to every summer as kids, as though the image itself might guide her. She loved this place too much to leave it, she said. And Diane, who hadn't slept, simply nodded. As the week passed, the hope that had burned so brightly began to collapse in on itself. The volunteers thinned. The police started using words like routine and procedure. Diane refused to hear them. Every evening, she returned to the same spot on the cliffs, a thermos of coffee in one hand, Leah's jacket in the other. She would stand for hours, her face turned toward the horizon. The ocean seemed to echo her waiting, vast, silent, unreadable. Sometimes at night, people swore they could hear her voice calling out, faint and trembling through the fog. Others said it was just the wind, catching on the rocks in strange ways. But even the skeptics started avoiding that stretch of road after dark. There was something different about it now. The way the fog lingered longer, the way sound seemed swallowed midair. On the 7th day, a storm rolled in. The waves hit the shore with an anger no one had felt all summer. When the rain began, Diane stayed on the cliffs, soaked through, until Sheriff Halpern finally led her back to his car. "The ocean keeps secrets," she said quietly, staring out the window. But not forever. In the weeks that followed, the search slowed, then stopped. The official investigation remained open, but the flyers faded in the sun. The town began to resume its rhythm. The mail delivered. The market reopened. Teenagers laughing again, but it was never the same rhythm as before. Something in Santa Marina's pulse had changed, like a skip beat no one could fix. The Warrens held a small vigil by the cliffs a month later. Candles flickered in jars, trembling in the wind. People sang softly, though no one remembered the tune. The light from the flames glowed against their faces. Neighbors, classmates, strangers, all standing together, not because they understood what had happened, but because they couldn't bear not to. After the crowd dispersed, Diane stayed behind. She placed Leah's camera strap on the guardrail, the same one she clutched that first night, and whispered something no one heard. The tide rose higher, licking at the rocks below, washing the candle wax into the sea. In time, Santa Marina became quieter about it. People stopped mentioning Leah's name out loud, afraid of summoning the wrong kind of silence. But the absence never left. It lingered in the rusted hinges of the lighthouse gate, in the hiss of waves under moonlight, in the distant cries of gulls that never seemed to land. To this day, locals will tell you the sea that summer looked different, darker, heavier, like it was holding a secret too large to surface. They'll tell you the cliffs remember, that the wind, when it passes through pines, carries her name in pieces. And they'll tell you that if you listen carefully at dusk, you can still hear the sound of her mother's voice, not pleading anymore, but promising that she will keep waiting until the ocean finally gives her daughter back. 3 weeks after the last search party had folded their maps and gone home, Santa Marina began to exhale again, not in relief, but in resignation. The missing posters were fading on telephone poles. The ocean had resumed its indifferent rhythm, and Leah Warren's name had started to drift into that strange purgatory between tragedy and myth. But then, on an ordinary Monday morning, the quiet cracked. It was just before sunrise when Amy Collar found the envelope. She had woken early, unable to sleep, the kind of restless dawn where dreams leave behind a residue of unease. When she opened her front door to fetch the paper, she saw it. A plain white envelope taped carefully to the wood. Sealed but unstamped, her name typed neatly on the front. No address, no sender. The tape was new, still tacky. Whoever left it had done. So during the night, Amy stood there for a moment, staring. The street was silent except for the rustling of the palms. She peeled it off and turned it over, half expecting to find a joke, some cruel prank. But inside was a single sheet of paper, thick, old-fashioned, folded once. The words, typed in uneven black ink, read. She saw something SHE shouldn't have. That was all. No signature. No date. No explanation. Amy dropped the paper. It fluttered onto the porch like a dead leaf. For a few seconds she couldn't breathe. Then she was running, across the street, barefoot, to the Warren house. She pounded on the door until Diane opened it, startled and pale. When she handed her the note, Diane's hands shook. She read it once, then again, and said nothing. By mid-morning, the sheriff's deputies were there. They sealed the envelope in plastic, dusted it for fingerprints, examined the typeface. It was from a manual typewriter. They said, old, probably 1950s. The ink was uneven, the pressure inconsistent, suggesting someone had typed in haste. But there were no usable prints, no trace DNA, no sign of forced entry or trespass. Whoever had left it knew how to vanish as quietly as Leah had. The sheriff, now exhausted from weeks of dead ends, tried to sound calm. Could be a hoax, he told the family. We've had these before. But even he didn't believe his own voice. The timing was too strange. The message too precise. The note became the talk of the town by sunset. Some said it was a sick prank from high school kids, trying to revive the drama. Others whispered that it was from the person who took Leah, a taunt, a warning, a confession disguised as prophecy. Amy couldn't sleep that night. Every sound outside felt magnified. The creak of branches, the scrape of wind against glass. She thought she saw someone standing across the street under the street lamp, a tall figure in a long coat. But when she blinked, it was gone. She called the sheriff again. They sent a car to circle the block. Nothing. The next morning, reporters arrived before breakfast. They took photos of Amy's porch, the note in its plastic sleeve. The Santa Marina Times ran a front-page headline. Cryptic message deepens teen mystery. Beneath it, the grainy image of Leah's smiling face. Her school photo, again and again, like an icon too familiar to still feel real. For Diane, the note reopened every wound. She spent hours reading it, tracing the indentations where the keys had pressed through. The way the letters were slightly misaligned. The crooked E, the faint ghost of another word beneath shouldn't, as if someone had retyped it over a mistake. It's him, she whispered once, though no one asked who she meant. In town, paranoia began to ripple. Parents kept children inside after dark. Teenagers canceled bonfires. Neighbors glanced twice at passing cars. A woman claimed she saw a man at the cliffs the night before the note appeared, smoking and staring out to sea. Another said she'd heard typing coming from the old post office after midnight, even though the building had been abandoned for years. Sheriff Halpern tried to steady the panic. He ordered a review of all typewriter ownership records in the county, a meaningless gesture, but it gave people something to cling to. They questioned every teacher, every clerk, every office that still kept one. None matched. Late that week, Amy received another envelope. This one blank, containing only a torn corner of photo paper. She couldn't tell if it was from a Polaroid or a darkroom print, but on the back, in faint pencil, were the words, "Light Lies." She turned it over and over, hoping for more, but that was all. She handed it to the sheriff, who added it to the growing file of oddities that led nowhere. And yet, beneath the fear, something else took hold, curiosity. People began re-examining Leah's photographs, looking for hidden clues, reflections, coded messages. Someone claimed that in her last Polaroid, if you magnified the horizon enough, You could see a figure, small, distant, half-formed. Another person swore the ocean line curved too sharply, as though edited, though Polaroids couldn't be altered that way. What began as a tragedy was now a story, the kind of story that devours the truth. Leah became both victim and mystery, her memory shaped by rumor. The note had given the town permission to imagine, and imagination is often more dangerous than facts. But for Diane, none of it felt like imagination. One evening, as she sat alone in Leah's room, the envelope on her lap, she noticed something she hadn't before. The faint smell of salt on the paper, the edges slightly wrinkled as if damp. She thought of the cliffs, of the sea breeze that never stopped whispering to the nights, and felt her chest tighten. Someone was there, she murmured to herself. Someone watched her that night. Days later, Amy confessed something she kept secret, that a week before Leah disappeared, she'd received a strange phone call. A man's voice, calm, distant, asking if Leah still carried a camera everywhere. When she'd asked who it was, he'd hung up. Amy had dismissed it then, thinking it was a prank. Now, the memory made her shake. The sheriff asked why she hadn't mentioned it sooner. She said, "Because I didn't want it to be real." The note changed the case completely. It turned the disappearance into a message, a narrative with intent. It wasn't just about a girl who was gone. It was about someone who wanted people to know why. That night, as the sun sank in the Pacific, Diane drove to the cliffs and stood where Leah had last been seen. The waves were calm, the light perfect, the kind of light Leah used to chase. Diane unfolded the paper and read the words aloud. The sea barely stirred, as if listening. She saw something she shouldn't have. The wind caught the paper from her hand and carried it over the guardrail, tumbling it down into the blue. She didn't reach for it. She just watched it disappear, knowing it would sink, dissolve, become part of the same water that might still be holding her daughter's final secrets. And far below, with the tide curled into the rocks, something white bobbed for a moment before vanishing. A fragment of paper, or maybe film, catching one last glint of sunlight before the sea took it back. The town of Santa Marina had tried to settle back into its ordinary rhythm after the cryptic note, but whispers never fully dissipated. By the time the summer heat began to wane, investigators had started combing through archives and police reports with a diligence born of both desperation and fear. At first, they saw only what any casual glance would reveal. Leah Warren, a bright teenager, disappeared without trace, her last known location the cliffs above the Pacific. But as the days stretched into weeks, subtle patterns began to emerge, threads that tied her disappearance to other incidents that had, until now, seemed unrelated. In nearby towns, scattered along the same stretch of coast, there were records of other girls vanishing under circumstances that mirrored Leah's. Not immediately obvious, not easily connected, but there were similarities. Teenagers known for being observant, creative, unusually thoughtful, each of them carrying an object that documented the world in some way. A diary, a sketchbook, a camera. These disappearances had occurred over the previous 3 years, their details buried in old case files, dismissed by officers as runaways or accidents. Now, in light of Leah's vanishing and the note that followed, investigators began to wonder if there was a pattern they'd missed. Retired Detective Paul Renner was the first to articulate the possibility of a deliberate predator. He had once patrolled the cliffs of Santa Marina, known every road and inlet by heart, and he remembered seeing a man, an older, solitary figure, lingering near the edge on multiple occasions. He claimed the man had always carried a notebook and camera, documenting the waves, the rocks, the cliffs, and the people. He had the eyes of someone who collects secrets, Renner said decades later, his voice low and taut with memory. No one could trace him. No one knew his name, but his presence felt like an invisible cord linking Leah to the other disappearances. Forensic teams dug through the records of typewriters, trying to match the letters from the cryptic note with any machine in circulation. The typewriter had characteristics that suggested it was rare, perhaps imported from Europe, possibly hand-assembled. No local typewriters matched. The more investigators checked, the more they realized this was not a haphazard crime. Whoever had left the note was deliberate, informed, precise. The note wasn't just a warning. It was a message designed to be found, to provoke fear, to communicate control. Psychologists were brought in to analyze the wording. She saw something she shouldn't have, they said. It implies observation, knowledge, an awareness that carries consequences. The sentence itself was a trap, simple and direct, yet resonant in ways that forced the recipient, Amy Diane, the town, into fear. The grammar, the starkness, even the choice to type rather than handwrite, suggested detachment, a lack of emotional involvement, the cold efficiency of someone accustomed to manipulating attention. Meanwhile, locals began recalling details that seemed trivial at the time. The pale gold Plymouth parked near the cliffs the evening Leah disappeared. The strange man seen walking along the shore at dusk, carry what looked like a camera bag, lights moving along the coastline at odd hours, too high to be headlights, too deliberate to be stars. These recollections formed a mosaic of suspicion. The town was beginning to see the shape of something lurking beneath the ordinary, the invisible scaffolding of a predator who knew the edges of the coastline as well as he knew human behavior. Homicide specialists examining the cases across counties noticed another detail. All the victims had an intensity in their attention. They noticed small inconsistencies, subtle disturbances in the world around them that others overlooked. Leah's Polaroid photographs, now in the hands of investigators, revealed something similar. Images captured at angles that suggested she had been aware of being watched, or at least was capturing perspective others couldn't perceive. The last roll, especially, seemed to contain fragments of her anxiety, encoded in the framing and composition, a visual record of intuition that perhaps had saved her attention but not her safety. The detective files also included interviews with families. Each mother, father, or friend described a girl whose curiosity occasionally bordered on recklessness, but who was fundamentally cautious, aware of surroundings. This made the disappearances harder to reconcile. The victims were careful, yet someone had penetrated their world without leaving immediate trace. The pattern suggested meticulous planning, patience, and observation, traits that mirrored Leah's own, now inverted in terrifying ways. Some investigators began to use the term the Watcher, though no one knew if the moniker fit the reality. It became shorthand for the figure whose existence seemed implied across these incidents, a presence that moved through the towns with intent, collecting fragments of lives, leaving cryptic breadcrumbs like the note to Amy. The name spread quietly among families and officers, whispered when the children were out of earshot, a symbol for the unknown predator whose intelligence was as unsettling as his absence. By the end of the month, the search for physical clues had returned little, but the detectives had established a timeline, connecting sightings, disappearances, and objects left behind. Even the typewriter, mysterious and unmatched, was now considered part of the pattern. The more they looked, the more the case shifted from a single missing girl to a complex web of disappearances bound together by attention to detail, obsession, and, perhaps, ritual. At the same time, the town's collective imagination ran wild. Parents stopped letting their children roam alone. Teenagers avoided the cliffs, and whispers of the Watcher drifted through backyards, markets, and school corridors. The community's fear became tangible, a new, shared layer of reality over the sun-washed streets, the beaches, the palm-lined highways. Even those who did not directly interact with Leah felt the reach of something watching, something persistent, lingering at the margins of the known world. And through it all, Leah's last photographs became a centerpiece of this growing pattern. Specialists examined each frame, looking for anomalies, shadows, irregularities, and reflections. One image of the cliffs at dusk showed a distortion in the gradient of light near the edge of the frame. Another appeared to capture a shape in the water, a dark smudge that seemed to move when the photos were analyzed in sequence. These images became not just evidence, but a haunting lens into the possible awareness of the Watcher, as if Leah had noticed what others had not and tried, in her own way, to record it. The investigation in 1974 ended without resolution, but the pattern remained clear. Leah Warren's disappearance was not an isolated incident. It was part of a series of events that hinted at careful surveillance, a predator attuned to subtle cues, and a town unaware of the invisible layer of observation under its sunlit streets. The clues were fragmentary, tantalizing and terrifying. A typewritten note, a rare camera, shadows and photographs, rumors of a man along the cliffs, all suggesting someone who existed just out of reach, someone patient, someone deliberate. The sense of design, the invisible architecture fear, became the defining truth of Leah's case. Nothing concrete tied her to the other victims, yet everything implied the same invisible hand guiding events, leaving messages, marking moments, and vanishing before discovery. In the quiet corners of Santa Marina, in the police stations, in the whispered recollections of witnesses, the pattern had begun to crystallize. A predator who observed, who manipulated, who orchestrated. And though no one could name him, the town had begun to feel his presence everywhere. In the sway of trees along the highway, the shimmer of distant headlights, the echo of footsteps near empty trails. Every shadowed corner, every reflective surface, seemed a possible window into his vigilance. And in that realization, the story of Leah Warren grew larger than a single girl lost. It became the story of an unseen watcher, a string of mysteries, and the fragile boundary between the world we see and the world that watches us. The days following the arrival of the cryptic note blurred together for Diane Warren. Time lost its natural rhythm, folding into itself, measured only by the pull of the ocean tides and the haunting echo of Leah's absence. She wandered the house in a haze, unable to stay in one room for long, touching Leah's belongings as if the friction of fingers against fabric might spark a memory that could guide her to her daughter. The jacket Leah had worn the night she disappeared remained draped over a chair, its yellow fabric dull from sun and dust, a mute witness to the summer that had broken apart. Diane became fixated on the idea that the note was not random, that it contained clues intentionally left by someone who knew Leah had seen or discovered something. The phrasing, "she saw something S.H.E. shouldn't have," haunted her. It implied knowledge, awareness, consequence. Diane stared at the words over and over, trying to imagine what Leah could have stumbled upon. A hidden truth, a secret conversation, an object. But the possibilities were infinite, each darker than the last. Amy visited frequently, often bringing Leah's camera along. Together, they reviewed the last roll of photographs again and again, scanning the images for anomalies. Some photos were ordinary, the cliffs, the ocean, the long shadows of trees, but others seemed to contain hints of something off. A shadow in the corner of one frame that didn't align with the position of the sun. A small smudge on the horizon that looked vaguely human. The photos were fragmented, incomplete, yet each seemed charged with intention, as though Leah had unknowingly captured the presence of someone watching. Neighbors, friends, and acquaintances began to share their memories, contributing small, overlooked details that collectively formed a disquieting picture. Several recalled seeing a man in the vicinity of the cliffs, a tall figure with a camera, silent and observing, lingering longer than anyone would naturally. One of Leah's classmates remembered the man from a fair earlier that summer, standing apart from the crowd, seemingly detached yet attentive to the movements of everyone around him. No one knew his identity. No one could place him definitively, but the fragment suggested he had been present long before Leah's disappearance, a patient observer of her world. As the town whispered about these sightings, the psychological impact deepened. Children avoided paths near the cliffs. Teenagers hesitated to ride their bikes after school. Adults spoke of uneasy shadows, odd sounds, or headlights moving in impossible ways at night. The collective consciousness of San Marino had shifted, a subtle but persistent awareness that someone was watching. Not just Leah, but everyone. Fear became a tangible presence, coating the streets, the homes, the wind itself. Diane, unable to accept inaction, began her own investigation. She revisited places Leah had frequented, speaking quietly to anyone who might have seen her that evening. At the lighthouse, she asked the caretaker if he remembered seeing Leah near the edge of the cliffs at dusk. He did vaguely, but added that a figure had been there too, a man tall, silent, almost hidden in the failing light. Diane's heart raced. Everything seemed to converge on that place, on that time, on the moment Leah had vanished. In the weeks that followed, another envelope arrived at the Warren house, slightly more worn than the first. Inside, a single Polaroid fragment, torn and unmarked, with a pale imprint that was almost indecipherable. Diane studied it under sunlight and lamplight, tilting the paper to catch shadows that might reveal shapes. She imagined that the faint outline was a reflection of Leah's last moments, the smudge of someone standing just beyond the camera's frame. Anxiety gnawed at her. Someone had been communicating, leaving breadcrumbs yet remained untouchable. Friends who tried to console Diane could only offer partial relief. Amy suggested they compile the photos and notes into a visual map of Leah's movements. They traced the cliffs, the lighthouse, the curving road,